At my son's funeral. I walked into the dining room. My chair was missing. My daughter-in-law lifted her glass. "He's just the old man who keeps the house." My heart sank. They thought I was finished. Too weak to matter. But Derek's will, the one Marla hid, named me as the true heir of this villa and 3 cars. They tried to erase me. Instead, I was about to expose them, follow my story until the end, and tell me the city you're watching from. The villa was filled with voices, laughter even, though it was the evening of my son's funeral. Winter pressed against the windows in Asheville, a bitter cold that crept in no matter how high the fire in the hearth burned. The long oak table gleamed with polished plates and glasses, every place set carefully, every place but one. The chair I had always occupied, at the far end, opposite Derek, was missing, not pushed in, not set aside, gone, as if I had never belonged there. My eyes searched the room for it, but there was only the steady rhythm of forks scraping plates, the occasional burst of laughter that made the chandeliers tremble. A man should not have to eat alone in his own house. Yet I found myself with a plate balanced on my lap in the corner, tasting nothing, just listening to the clatter of dishes that once belonged to my wife, and now seemed claimed by someone else. It wasn't the absence of food that left the bitter taste, it was the absence of respect. My presence was tolerated, not welcomed. That truth pressed against me harder than the silence of the room where I chewed each bite slowly, pretending not to notice what everyone else had chosen not to see. Marla stood, her glass catching the light. She smiled, too wide, too confident, and raised her voice. "To Derek," she said, her words smooth, rehearsed. "And to the man who keeps this house standing, who makes sure everything runs." Her gaze slid toward me like the edge of a knife. "Luther, the caretaker." A ripple of laughter moved through the guests, not loud, but sharp enough. Some lowered their eyes, others exchanged glances, and 1 or 2 chuckled nervously. Caretaker, as if I had not raised Derek from a boy into a man, as if the memories in these walls had been built by anyone else. The title stripped me down to a hired hand in the very villa I had worked my fingers raw to maintain, a stranger in the place I had once called home. I lifted my glass, though my hand shook slightly. "To Derek," I managed. My voice sounded thin, as though the room swallowed it whole. I forced a smile, not for them, but for the ghost of my boy, who would have hated to see me shamed. Her words hung heavier than the silence that followed. They cut deeper than if she had said nothing at all. The faces blurred before me, and suddenly, memory pulled me backward. Derek's laugh, deep and warm, rang in my ears. "You'll never be alone, Dad. I promise you that," he had once told me, leaning against the hood of his car, sunlight bouncing off his hair. He had been so certain, and now he was gone. Marla's shadow stretched long across the dining table, swallowing every echo of that promise. She leaned in close to a cousin of Derek's, her lips brushing against his ear in a whisper. I watched their eyes dart toward me, then away. The words, "the estate," floated faintly across the space, followed by a small smirk from her. The villa. She spoke of it as though the ink had already dried, as though Derek's blood had been erased from the bricks and beams. I sat in stillness, keeping the storm inside. To speak now would be to reveal what I held close. Knowledge of Derek's will. The truth not yet known to her. Silence became my shield. The meal dragged into evening, every moment stretching like a taut string. My body felt heavier than the suit I wore, a suit meant for mourning but now soaked in humiliation. When the guests departed, laughter trailing into the night air, I lingered behind. The dining room was dim, candles smoldering down to stubs. My steps slowed as I reached the long table again. Derek's chair sat empty, his absence pressed down like stone. Yet in front of that empty space, Marla's glass of wine still rested, half drunk, her lipstick staining the rim. It struck like a blow, the way she had claimed the space as her own, not only at the table but in the very essence of my son's memory. Derek was gone, and she was already filling his place, not as a widow, but as an owner, a thought gnawed at me, harsh and unrelenting. If she could erase Derek this quickly, how long before she erased me? The morning light in Asheville carried a stillness that felt unnatural. After the funeral, I thought perhaps the house would be filled with quiet mourning, the kind that gives you space to breathe. Instead, what I heard was Marla's voice, sharp, casual, as though nothing had shifted in her world. From the hallway, I paused. She was on the phone, her tone breezy. "Yes, the villa's mine now. We'll talk about renovations soon." The words landed heavy. My hands curled against the wall for support. This house had been Derek's pride, a promise he made that I'd always have a roof over my head. Now it was being discussed like some trinket passed along at a yard sale. Later, when she left the room, I went to my drawer. My fingers trembled as I pulled out the folder where I kept Derek's documents, the title to the villa among them. I expected reassurance. Instead, my chest tightened. Stamped across the page was a transfer I had never signed. Somehow, quietly, it had been moved out of my name. The walls of the villa felt smaller then, as if they were already pushing me out. Stepping outside for fresh air, I hoped for something steady to cling to. For years, Derek had driven me in his BMW, the one that smelled faintly of leather and cologne. I used to watch him pull up the driveway, his grin shining through the windshield, waving like a boy again. But now, the space was bare. Only dark oil stains lingered, like shadows that refused to leave. Marla caught me staring. "Oh, the BMW?" she said without hesitation, as if I were asking about last week's groceries. I sold it quickly. It wasn't needed anymore. The words punched harder than any fist. I remembered the first ride Derek and I took in that car, driving into the mountains when the leaves turned gold. He had leaned over and said, "Dad, as long as I've got this car, you'll always have a seat next to me." That memory burned brighter now that the car itself was gone. I asked gently, though my voice cracked. "Why so soon?" She didn't flinch. "It was for the best. You won't be driving much longer anyway, will you?" The dismissiveness in her tone cut deeper than the sale itself. To her, I wasn't a father, not even a man who'd worked his whole life. I was simply someone waiting to fade. That night, as the house grew dark, I wandered the halls. My eyes traced the walls where Derek's photos once hung. His graduation, our fishing trip, the goofy smile he carried on his wedding day. Frame by frame, space by space, they were vanishing. What was left behind was bare paint, cold and indifferent. It struck me then. It wasn't just the car, the papers, or even the villa. It was my son's memory itself being stripped away. Each absence left a wound. Each missing piece of him reminded me of what was coming next. And in the silence of that hallway, with the shadows stretching long, a thought pressed heavy on my chest. If my son's presence could be wiped away this easily, what would they do to me? A week had passed since Derek's funeral, yet the ache had only deepened. That morning, I decided I couldn't carry the weight of confusion alone any longer. The villa, the missing car, Marla's growing control, it all gnawed at me. So I walked downtown, cane tapping against the cracked sidewalk, toward the one man I thought I could still trust, Harvey Bristow, my lawyer and an old friend. The office stood just as I remembered, tucked on the corner near the courthouse, its brass sign polished bright. I stepped inside, the faint smell of paper and lemon polish wrapping around me. The receptionist looked up, her smile tight. "I'm here to see Harvey," I said, trying to steady my voice. "It's important." She shifted in her chair. "Mr. Bristow is unavailable today." Unusual, I thought. Harvey was a man of habit, rarely unavailable without reason. Through the frosted glass at the end of the hallway, I caught a glimpse of his silhouette, moving papers on his desk. Our eyes met for the briefest second before he turned away. My chest tightened. He was there. He just wouldn't see me. The sting of betrayal burned hotter than the winter air outside. As I stepped back into the street, the cold settled into my bones. Each step home felt heavier, my figure blending into the city's rhythm, unseen, unnoticed. For years, I had walked these streets with Derek by my side, his easy laughter drawing people in. Now, even my lawyer, my ally, was beyond reach. By the time I returned to the villa, the sun had dipped low. Through the tall windows, light spilled from the living room where Marla entertained guests. Laughter and the clink of glasses carried into the night, sharp reminders of how little space my grief was allowed. I entered quietly, standing just inside the doorway. Not one face turned toward me. I might as well have been a shadow. Later, I climbed the stairs to my room, craving the quiet sanctuary of my bed. But when I turned the handle, it stopped short. The door was locked, confused. I knocked softly. Marla's voice floated down the hall, smooth and casual. "Colton needs the space. He's been restless. I'm sure you understand." A blanket was pressed into my hands. No apology, no acknowledgement of what that room meant, just a thin cover and the sofa waiting downstairs. The chill from the drafty windows gnawed at me as I stretched out, every spring in the cushions digging at my back. My body ached. But my dignity suffered worse. A man who once built this home alongside his son was now an afterthought in his own living room. Staring into the darkness, I let memory wash over me. The weekends Derek and I spent hammering nails, laying flooring, laughing when a board went crooked. Those walls had heard our bond grow strong, and now they bore witness to my quiet displacement. Confronting Marla would change nothing. Her smirk told me she believed she'd already won. Patience, I whispered to myself. Patience might yet be my shield. Sleep came in fits. Around midnight, I stirred at the sound of hushed voices. Marla's whisper carried from upstairs. Phone pressed to her ear. "The paperwork is almost done. He won't have any claims soon." I froze, pulse pounding. Paperwork. What paperwork? The villa's deed was already gone. The car sold. My bedroom stripped from me. What else had slipped through my fingers without my knowing? The darkness above felt suffocating as one thought consumed me. What else had already been taken from me, and what was left to lose? The evening had barely settled when the heaviness in my chest grew worse than usual. Sitting up from the sofa where I had been forced to sleep, a harsh cough rumbled through me, shaking my frame until I felt warmth on my palm. The sight of fresh blood smeared across my handkerchief jolted me more than I cared to admit. Leaning against the kitchen counter for balance, I steadied myself, fighting the dizziness. Across the room, Marla poured herself a tall glass of red wine. She didn't even glance my way until the cough returned. Louder, wetter, impossible to hide. When her eyes finally met mine, there was no concern in them, just the faintest, deliberate curve of her lips, a smile. It wasn't sympathy, it wasn't kindness, it was recognition, almost satisfaction, as if my weakness validated something she had been waiting for. The blood still stained the handkerchief in my hand, and she looked at it briefly before turning her back and swirling her glass. The cruelty was so quiet, so calm, it cut deeper than any shouted insult. I stood frozen in that kitchen, not by the cough, but by the realization that she wanted me frail. My decline was her convenience. My body betrayed me with every breath, and she was content to watch. The following morning, I woke stiff and aching, my blanket slipping from the sofa to the floor. Sunlight leaked into the living room, and voices carried from the dining room. Marla had gathered a few visiting relatives. I could hear the warmth in her voice, carefully measured. As she spoke, "I've decided to take some time off work to care for Luther. He needs me right now." The room hummed with approval. One aunt praised her for being selfless. Another remarked on how lucky I was to have such a devoted daughter-in-law. I stood in the doorway, silent, clutching the edge of the frame. If any of them noticed the disbelief in my eyes, they ignored it. My body shook, not from the cough this time, but from the bitter irony. The same woman who smiled at my blood was now being celebrated as my guardian angel. Every word she spoke was a performance. She sat straighter, lowered her tone to sound serious, and reached for a tissue at just the right moment, as if to show them how much she carried on her shoulders. Watching it, I felt a rush of anger restrained behind clenched teeth. I wanted to shout the truth, but the room was against me before I even opened my mouth. As the relatives left, hugging Marla for her sacrifice. I caught the flicker in her expression when no one else was looking. The mask slipped for just a second, her eyes calculating, her jaw tightening. It wasn't care she was offering, it was control. Each move she made positioned her as the only responsible figure in the house, the only one with authority to speak for me. My sickness had become her weapon. Later that night, long after the house was quiet, I lay awake on the sofa, staring at the dark ceiling. The cough returned in waves, muffled into the blanket so as not to wake Colton upstairs. Then, through the thin wall, I heard her voice, low, but clear enough. The judge will see the papers soon. With me as guardian. It's just a matter of time. Guardian. The word rang in my ears like a verdict. She wasn't just playing nurse. She was preparing to own me, my choices, my estate, my very name. The smile she'd worn while I bled made sense now. To her, my weakness wasn't a burden. It was leverage. The house had fallen into an unusual hush that morning. Winter light seeped through the villa windows, pale and cold. From my chair in the kitchen, I heard Marla's voice, low, clipped. She held a folder tight against her side while pacing toward the hallway. I couldn't catch every word, but the tone was calculated, rehearsed. When she noticed me glancing her way, she offered no greeting, just a quick turn and the sharp click of her bedroom door locking behind her. Silence lingered heavier than the frost outside. The coffee in my cup tasted like nothing. That folder had weight to it, not in paper, but in purpose. Instinct told me I was no longer just a bystander in this house. Hours later, while moving through the hallway, I noticed a desk drawer in the study left slightly ajar. My breath slowed. That was unlike Marla. She was meticulous, obsessive about appearances. Curiosity outweighed caution. I eased it open and found a neat stack of legal documents, each marked with the county court's seal. My name leapt from the page. Guardianship petition. The words cut deeper than any insult she had ever thrown at me. Marla Kinnear had filed to declare me mentally unfit, placing me under her care as if I were a child, or worse, a burden to be managed. The petition painted a picture of a man incapable of handling his own affairs, of losing grasp of reality, lies crafted with the precision of someone who had been planning long before the funeral. For a moment the room tilted, and I gripped the drawer's edge to steady myself. Shame and anger wrestled inside, each threatening to break through. My own daughter-in-law wasn't content with cold smiles or rearranged bedrooms. She was preparing to erase me in ink, to take away my independence one signature at a time. A soft knock startled me. I pushed the drawer closed, barely in time before opening the door. Evelyn Rooker, my neighbor from across the street, stood there with a casserole in her hands. Her eyes, warm and steady, searched my face. "You look pale, Luther. Thought you could use a meal." Her kindness broke something in me. Without thinking, I whispered the truth about the documents, the words mentally unfit, the feeling of betrayal that was eating me alive. Evelyn set the dish down, resting a hand lightly on my arm. "This isn't right. You need help, and not the kind she pretends to offer. Harvey Bristow might be avoiding you now, but he's a man of conscience. We'll find a way to reach him." The relief in confiding was brief, almost fragile. A gust of cold air followed her out, and I stood in the silence again, clutching the memory of her words like a rope in deep water. That evening, Marla returned. Her heels tapped the floor sharply as she moved about the villa. When she entered the study, I watched from the doorway as her eyes flickered to the drawer. She noticed, just slightly disturbed, but enough. Her glance cut toward me, then back to her wine glass. At dinner she carried on, speaking pleasantly with Colton about school, but her gaze lingered every so often, long enough for me to feel the silent accusation. "You know," she said nothing outright. That silence was her weapon now. She wanted me uneasy, second-guessing whether I had given myself away. Later that night, the villa lay quiet again, but the quiet carried teeth. Alone in the study, I pulled the petition back out and traced the words with trembling fingers. Mentally unfit. Guardian. The ink might as well have been chains. The thought of Derek, my boy, filled me with both ache and resolve. He had once promised that I'd never be left to fade away. Now, his widow was twisting the law to do exactly that. The document shook in my hands. Though not from weakness alone, determination kindled in the cracks of despair. "She's planning to erase me," I whispered into the empty room. On paper, in life, in memory. The judge's seal wasn't there yet, but I knew what came next if I stayed silent. Time was running out, and I had to act before dignity itself was signed away. The morning air bit at my skin as I pushed open the heavy glass doors of the courthouse in Asheville. The building carried a stillness that felt like judgment itself, waiting for men like me to stumble inside with questions they didn't want answered. I held the petition papers tight in my hand, their edges digging into my palm like a warning. Harvey Bristow's office was dim, blinds drawn against the pale winter sun. He looked up when I entered, those old lawyer's eyes softer than I remembered, but heavy with things he couldn't easily say. I laid the papers on his desk without a word. He didn't need me to explain. "She's filed for guardianship." "Luther," Harvey said quietly, his voice like gravel rolling in a dry streambed. "If the judge signs this, you'll lose every right you still have." The room seemed to close in around me. Every breath weighed twice as much, my chest fighting to draw it in. Betrayal wasn't just whispered in hallways anymore. It was printed, sealed, made official. For a long moment, I said nothing. The clock ticked above us, each second like a hammer against the back of my skull. Then I forced the words out. "My son trusted her to honor his memory, and this is what she does. Strip me like an old coat no one wears anymore?" Harvey rubbed his temple. "There's more. The petition already has a hearing scheduled, 2 weeks. And it cites, well, it says you're suffering from progressive illness, that you can't manage your own affairs." A flash of heat shot through me. My cane slammed against the hardwood floor with a sharp crack that echoed through the office. "I'm standing here, Harvey, talking to you, reading every line of that garbage. They think a cough makes me worthless. They're writing me off while I'm still breathing." Anger burned, but beneath it lay something darker. Fear. If a judge stamped that paper, it wouldn't matter what I said, what I remembered, or how steady my hands were. In their eyes, I'd already be gone. Harvey leaned forward, lowering his voice. "We'll fight this, but you need witnesses, people who will testify to your competence. Evelyn would stand for you. I know she would. Maybe Colton too. He's young, but his word counts. Show them you're not alone, that you're still you." The thought of dragging my grandson into this poisoned mess tightened my jaw. Yet pride couldn't outweigh necessity. I nodded slowly. "She won't erase me. Not on paper. Not in life." That night, the villa seemed colder than the courthouse. Marla stood by the fireplace when I returned, her glass of wine glowing amber in the firelight. She smiled, too sweet to be genuine. "I've scheduled a doctor's assessment for you," she said, her voice smooth as honey hiding the sting of vinegar. "Just standard procedure, of course. You'll do fine if you remember what day it is." Her smirk lingered on my weakness, her words digging into the fresh wound Harvey had revealed. The assessment wasn't care, it was a trap, dressed in white coats and clipboards, designed to portray me as a man already slipping away. Later, alone in the small room she had left me with, I sat at the desk. The petition papers spread before me. My fingers traced the ink until they trembled. "She wants me judged before I'm even gone," I whispered to the silence, to the ghost of Derek, who should have been here to see this. But despair didn't win. My hand closed tight, crumpling the edge of the paper. I would not let her win, not with silence, not with lies. The ride to the doctor's office was quiet, except for the sound of Marla's fingers tapping against the steering wheel. Each click felt rehearsed, deliberate, like a reminder that she was in control of the moment. Her smile never faltered, a thin stretch of politeness that masked the satisfaction behind her eyes. Sitting in the passenger seat, I caught my reflection in the window, an old man, thinner than he once was, his shoulders a little hunched. Yet inside, the fire hadn't gone out. The office sat tucked between a row of brick buildings on Asheville's main street, with a brass plate by the door that read Dr. Ellis. The man himself greeted us warmly, his handshake firm, but there was a flicker of recognition when his eyes lingered on Marla. It wasn't the kind of polite familiarity a doctor should have with a patient's daughter-in-law. No, it felt like they'd spoken before, more than once. I took a seat across from his desk. The smell of antiseptic sharp in the air. The ticking of the clock on the wall seemed louder than usual, every second pushing me toward judgment. "Mr. Bianchi," Dr. Ellis said with practiced calm, "I'd just like to ask you a few questions. Routine. Nothing to worry about." The questions came quickly. "What day is it today?" "February 9th, I answered without hesitation. "And who is the president?" "Biden," I said firmly, my eyes narrowing. But Marla leaned in, her voice soft, almost pitying. "He forgets sometimes," she added, smiling at the doctor as though she were doing me a kindness. Something inside me twisted. I wanted to shout, to slam my fist on the desk, to demand that the truth be seen. But I held myself steady, answering each question with crisp precision, even as her interruptions chipped away at my credibility. I could feel the invisible trap tightening, each word of hers a thread sewn into a narrative I hadn't chosen. Then, for a moment, fortune tilted my way. Dr. Ellis excused himself to fetch something from another room, leaving his desk unattended. I shifted in my chair and caught sight of an open folder. My heart thudded as I leaned closer. Inside, handwritten notes jumped off the page. Words scrawled in Marla's hand. Memory lapses. Irrational anger. Unable to manage daily life. It wasn't his file. It was hers. Her script. Her version of me. Already written before I'd walked into the room. My throat tightened. She had planted the seeds. And this visit was only the harvest. I sat back before the doctor returned, forcing calm onto my face. Marla's eyes flicked toward me, sharp, suspicious. She hadn't noticed what I'd seen, but she sensed something. I folded my hands in my lap, willing my trembling fingers to still. On the way home, silence filled the car. Marla hummed quietly as if satisfied with her performance. In the back seat, Colton sat with his backpack on his lap, staring out the window. Then, slowly, his gaze shifted to me. His eyes were uncertain, but they carried something else, a question, a recognition of the way Marla had cut across my answers, the way the doctor had listened more to her than to me. The boy said nothing, but in that silence I heard a lifeline. Someone else had witnessed the performance. Someone else saw the truth. Hope and sorrow tangled in my chest. Hope that he might one day speak for me. Sorrow that a child had to carry such a burden. That evening, the villa's hallways felt heavier than usual. Marla paced from room to room, her phone glued to her ear, her voice carried down the hall, sharp and satisfied. "The doctor's report will help me," she said into the receiver. "The judge won't question it." "It's all lining up perfectly." I stood in the shadows, leaning against the doorframe, the weight of her words pressing on me. She was building a case, brick by brick, wrapping it all in the language of care while dismantling everything I was. But she didn't know everything. She didn't know I'd seen her handwriting, the proof of her manipulation. She didn't know the fire inside me was still burning. A whisper escaped my lips, quiet but firm. "She thinks I'm finished, but I still have a voice." For the first time in weeks, resolve took root. I would not simply endure. I would resist. The afternoon sun fell gently across the porch, the wood planks warm under my cane. For the first time in days, the house was quiet. Marla had taken a call in the back room, her laughter muffled by walls. I sat in the stillness, drawing in the scent of pine from the hills, when a familiar figure appeared at the gate. Evelyn Rooker walked toward me with purpose, her steps brisk but her face shadowed by something heavier. She carried a casserole dish in one hand, but it was the sealed envelope under her arm that caught my attention. She placed the dish on the table and leaned close, her voice low. "You need to see this before it's too late," she whispered. The way she said it, clipped and urgent, made my chest tighten. My eyes shifted to the envelope. Her hand lingered on it for a moment, as though releasing a burden too heavy to carry alone. I nodded slowly, my fingers trembling as I took it from her. Inside the villa, with the curtains drawn and the hallways silent, I slid a finger under the seal and unfolded the contents. My breath caught in my throat. There it was, Derek's will, clear as the day it had been signed, his name etched in bold strokes, his words unmistakable, the villa, the 3 cars, all of it left directly to me. My knees nearly gave way, and I had to grip the edge of the table to steady myself. Derek's voice rose in my memory, his quiet reassurance on a long drive years ago. Promising. "You'll never be left behind, Dad. I'll make sure of it." Yet here I was, nearly erased, watching his promise twisted into dust. Evelyn touched my arm, grounding me. "A friend at the courthouse slipped me a copy. Marla's been playing a dangerous game. Luther, now you have the proof." Hope surged, sharp and raw, cutting through weeks of humiliation. Proof, real, undeniable proof, that Marla had lied, that all her smug claims, her whispered phone calls, her plans to bury me under legal filings, were built on deception. That evening, the dining room filled with Marla's voice. She leaned back in Derek's old chair, phone pressed to her ear, boasting to some confidant about her house. The words cut like glass, but tonight I had something sharper. I waited until she ended her call, then stepped forward with Derek's will in hand. My cane tapped against the hardwood floor, echoing in the silence that fell. Without a word, I laid the document on the table in front of her. Her eyes scanned the page. For the briefest second, her smile faltered, the mask slipping, but then it hardened, her lips curling into defiance. "You shouldn't be digging where you don't belong," she said, her voice cold and precise. The air thickened. I stood my ground, though my legs shook. Colton sat nearby, his small hands clutching a toy car. His eyes flicked between me and his mother, confusion clouding his face. "Grandpa," he asked softly, "is that what Dad really wanted?" The innocence in his voice sliced through the room. Marla snapped at him instantly. "Go upstairs, Colton, now." But the boy didn't move. His wide eyes stayed on me, searching for truth, and in that gaze, I felt Derek's presence alive again. Marla's control cracked, if only for a heartbeat. The silence broke when she snatched the will from the table, her nails scraping against the paper. With a sharp rip, she clutched it to her chest and stormed down the hallway. The slam of her bedroom door shook the walls. Later that night, Evelyn returned under the cover of darkness. We sat in the kitchen, voices low. "She knows the truth exists," I told her, my voice rasping with exhaustion, "and now she's desperate to bury it." Even as I spoke, footsteps echoed faintly outside the door. Slow, deliberate. Someone was listening in the dark. My chest tightened with the weight of it all. Proof was in my hands once, but Marla's desperation had turned it into something even more dangerous. The battle was no longer just about paper. It was about survival. The morning light pushed through the curtains, weak and gray, carrying no warmth. The villa felt different, too quiet, yet somehow full of tension. When I shuffled into the kitchen, Colton was already there, leaning against the counter with his arms crossed. His eyes met mine, hesitant, searching. "Grandpa," he whispered, almost afraid his mother would hear, "can I stay with you today?" The question sat heavy between us. His voice was small, but the weight of it pressed into my chest. He hadn't asked to stay with his mother. He had asked for me. Marla breezed into the kitchen soon after, still in her robe, but she didn't offer a greeting. She poured herself coffee, never once looking in my direction. Breakfast came and went without words, only the scrape of a spoon against a bowl. The coldness in her silence cut sharper than any insult she had ever spoken aloud. By mid-morning, the phone rang, one call, then another, relatives checking in, not to console me, but to ask questions they were too cautious to pose directly. I could hear Evelyn's influence in their voices. She had clearly whispered about the will. A cousin murmured, "Is it true Derek left the house to you?" Another hesitated before asking, "Why is Marla saying otherwise?" Each call cracked the surface of her polished facade. The family, once content to accept Marla's control, was beginning to wonder if they had been misled. In the corner of the room, Colton sat quietly, pretending to play on his phone, but his ears were sharp. I could see the conflict written on his face, his mother's authority against the pull of his father's memory. The air shifted when the mail arrived. Among the envelopes was one marked with the seal of the county courthouse. My hands shook as I tore it open. Inside lay the summons, an official notice scheduling a hearing to clarify Derek's estate. The letters blurred for a moment as tears pricked my eyes. This was it. The truth, once hidden in shadows and whispers, was being pulled into the light. Before I could fold the paper back into its envelope, Marla snatched it from my hands. Her eyes flared with a fire I had come to know well. "You're trying to ruin me," she screamed. "After everything I've done for you, this is how you repay me?" Her voice rose high, trembling with both anger and desperation. She slammed the letter down on the table so hard that the salt shaker toppled over. Colton flinched, his spoon clattering in the cereal bowl he had forgotten. For a moment, the kitchen felt like a courtroom already, with Marla playing prosecutor and me the accused. The rest of the day she barely stopped moving. Phone calls to relatives, to supposed friends, to anyone who would listen. I could hear her through the thin walls, threatening to cut people out of her house if they dared to doubt her. The words were sharp, reckless, and loud enough that Colton recorded one of her outbursts on his phone. He caught my eye afterward, his lips pressed tight in a silent message. We both knew this recording could matter. That evening, I retreated to the study. It was one of the few rooms she hadn't stripped of Derek's memory. Shelves still held books my son had read, their spines worn with time. I pulled the will from my jacket pocket and laid it across my knees. My hands trembled as I traced Derek's name with a finger. "Son," I whispered into the dim silence, "I will not let her erase your last wish. Not while I can still stand." Just as the words left me, the quiet broke. Heavy footsteps pounded toward the study door. Then her fist, sharp and angry, rattled the wood. "What did you tell them, old man?" Marla's voice was cracked, shaking with fury and fear in equal measure. I gripped the will tighter, my heart hammering. The storm outside had finally reached the walls of this house. The courthouse smelled faintly of old wood and dust, its halls echoing with footsteps and hushed voices. I gripped Derek's will so tightly that the edges cut into my palm. Every step toward the courtroom door felt heavier than the last. When I pushed it open, dozens of eyes turned to me. Whispers rippled through the benches. Neighbors, relatives, strangers, all watching to see if the old man could stand against the storm. Marla entered soon after, dressed sharply, her hair pinned tight, her heels clicking with rehearsed confidence. She carried herself as though the building belonged to her, but her eyes betrayed her, darting, quick, unsettled. She caught my gaze for a moment and smirked, the kind of smile that said she thought she had already won. The gavel struck, and silence fell. The judge cleared his throat, his expression unreadable. Marla's lawyer rose first. His voice was smooth, confident. "Your Honor, this case is a tragedy of grief gone astray. My client, Marla Kinnear, is the rightful heir to her late husband's estate. Unfortunately, her father-in-law has become bitter, confused, and is now clinging to false documents in an attempt to undermine her." A few relatives shifted in their seats. The lawyer's words painted me as delusional, a relic trying to grasp at control. My heart pounded against my ribs, but I kept my face still, my hands folded over Derek's will. When Harvey Bristow stood, the room's air shifted. His tone was calm, measured, but it carried a quiet authority. "Your Honor, Derek Lasker made his intentions clear before his passing. His father, Luther Bianchi, is not only his surviving parent but the rightful heir to his estate. We present the original notarized will, signed and sealed, naming Mr. Bianchi as beneficiary." He placed the document on the table before the judge. My throat tightened. For a moment, I thought I could hear Derek's voice, telling me I wasn't alone in this. Marla sprang from her chair, fury breaking her polished exterior. "That's a forgery!" The judge raised a hand for order. "Mrs. Kinnear, you will have your turn." I sat frozen, the sound of my heartbeat loud in my ears. This wasn't just a courtroom. It was the battlefield where my son's last wishes would either be honored or destroyed. Evidence rolled out slowly, page by page. Harvey laid out signatures, notary seals, and affidavits, each one a stone in the foundation we were building against her lies. Marla countered with accusations, her lawyer pressing the image of me as senile, unfit, living in a world of memory and bitterness. Then the judge leaned forward. "Do we have testimony? Proof beyond these documents?" A hush fell. For a heartbeat, it seemed everything could collapse under doubt. Then, from the second row, Colton stood. His hands shook, but his voice, though soft, carried, I have something." The boy held out his phone. His eyes flicked to mine, pleading for courage, and I gave a small nod. The judge allowed him to approach. When the recording played, the room changed. Marla's voice filled the chamber, sharp and vicious. "If they don't take my side, they're out. This house is mine, and I'll cut anyone out who says otherwise." Gasps erupted from the benches. The mask she had worn for so long shattered in an instant. Faces turned toward her, disbelief mingling with disgust. She lunged forward, shrieking, "Give me that!" But the bailiff stepped between her and the boy, steady and immovable. Her voice cracked now, shrill with desperation. "He's twisting everything." But the words hung empty in the air. The courtroom had heard her without filters, without excuses. The judge struck his gavel. "We will reconvene tomorrow morning for final testimonies and a ruling." His eyes scanned the room, lingering on me. Then Marla, "This matter is far from finished." The courtroom released a collective breath. People began to shuffle out, whispering louder now, their heads shaking at Marla's outburst. Outside, the sun had dipped low, casting the courthouse steps in gold and shadow. I held Derek's will close to my chest, its weight both heavy and steadying. Colton slipped his hand into mine, his grip small but strong. "We'll win, Grandpa," he said quietly, his eyes shining with something that looked a lot like hope. I squeezed his hand back, my throat too tight to answer. Then, cutting through the murmurs of the crowd, her voice rang out, piercing, venomous. "This isn't over," Marla hissed, her eyes burning holes into me. "You'll regret this." The crowd stilled. For a moment, the courthouse steps felt colder than any winter night. The night before the verdict, the house felt colder than it ever had. The walls of the villa loomed in silence. Their shadows stretched long across the floor. I sat in my armchair with the lamp dimmed low, staring at a photograph of Derek I kept on the side table. His smile, broad, unburdened, stared back at me, and I could almost hear his voice telling me again, "Dad, I'll always make sure you're taken care of." That promise had carried me through the days since his funeral, but tonight it weighed heavy, reminding me of the cost of fighting to protect what he had left behind. Sleep refused to come. My mind turned over every moment of the trial, every word Marla had twisted. The loneliness of the fight pressed down. But then I heard a soft knock. Evelyn stepped inside with a steaming mug of tea, her voice gentle. "You don't have to carry all of this on your own, Luther." Her words cut through the fog of exhaustion. For the first time that night, I set the photo down and let myself breathe a little easier, reminded that not all bonds frayed when tested. Morning brought no peace. The air was damp with winter fog when I heard a knock at my door. Marla stood there, not with her usual fire, but with something softer, almost rehearsed. She held her hands together like a child making a plea. "Maybe we don't have to keep doing this," she said. "We can settle outside of court, for Colton's sake." Her tone dripped with false concern, but I could see the panic swimming behind her eyes. She wanted a way out. For a moment, I thought about how tired I was, how much easier it might be to agree. But then Derek's voice echoed again, and the strength in me rose. "No more lies, Marla," I said, steadying my words. "We'll let the judge decide." Her mask slipped for just a second, bitterness flashing before she walked away. I closed the door, feeling sadness settle in my chest, not because of what she had done, but because of what she had become. By mid-morning, the courthouse loomed once more. Its tall columns rose against the gray sky, as heavy and immovable as the burden on my shoulders. I walked slowly up the steps, cane in one hand, Derek's will tucked close against my chest. Colton walked beside me, his small hand occasionally brushing mine as if he knew I needed the reminder I wasn't alone. Harvey joined us at the doors, his face calm but firm, a man ready for battle. Inside, the air buzzed with whispers. Relatives filled the benches, some avoiding my eyes, others nodding faintly in silent support. Marla sat at the opposite table, her polished appearance betraying small cracks, eyes darting, lips pressed too tightly. The weight in the room was thick, everyone waiting for a conclusion that would change the course of our lives. I sat down, my heart beating not just for myself, but for Derek, for Colton, and for the dignity that still belonged to me. When the judge entered, the room froze. Papers shuffled, voices hushed. Harvey stood tall as Derek's will was presented again. The judge leaned forward, eyes tracing every line, every notarized signature. Marla interrupted, her voice rising higher with each plea. "This is forged. I gave up everything for this family." Tears streaked her cheeks, but the words sounded hollow in the echo of that grand chamber. I described the moment in my mind as if time had stopped. The faces around me blurred, my focus fixed only on the gavel resting near the judge's hand. I had faced hardship before, but never had my very identity been put on trial this way. It wasn't just about property or papers, it was about whether a father's place, a man's dignity, would be honored or erased. My chest tightened, but beneath the fear was a strange steadiness, the resolve of a man who had weathered storms before. As the hearing stretched on, the silence became unbearable. The judge's eyes scanned between me, Marla, and the will. My palms were damp, the edges of the paper trembling in my hands. Then I felt a small nudge. Colton leaned closer, his whisper barely audible. "We'll win, Grandpa." Just those words, quiet but sure, filled me with a calm I hadn't felt in months. The judge lifted the gavel, voice solemn. "The estate of Derek Lasker." The sentence hung in the air, suspended like a final breath before dawn. Every soul in that room leaned forward, waiting for the words that would decide not just the house, not just the cars, but the legacy of a son and the dignity of his father. The gavel struck wood, and the sound echoed through the courtroom like a bell ringing over the valley after a storm. The judge's words followed, calm but cutting. Derek's will was valid, my rights as heir and executor upheld, and Marla's claims stripped away, the villa, the cars, every scrap of memory my son left behind, restored to me by law, as they had always been meant to be. For a moment, the air seemed to thin, and in that silence I could almost hear Derek's voice again, steady and sure, reminding me that he'd never leave me without protection. The ache in my chest gave way to something close to relief, though it was heavy relief, weighed down by all the months of humiliation and fear. The eyes in the room turned from Marla to me, and I knew in that instant this fight had been more than about property. It had been about dignity. Marla's composure shattered in an instant. She lurched forward, shouting words that lost their shape in the air, shrill with desperation. "He manipulated all of you." Her lawyer tugged at her sleeve, but she tore free, her voice breaking as tears streaked her cheeks. The relatives who once muttered polite agreements with her now avoided her gaze, whispering, shaking their heads. Her fall was not just written in ink, it was written in the faces of the community she thought she could charm. Colton sat stiffly at my side, eyes wide, lips pressed thin. He didn't move until Marla was escorted out, her cries dissolving into the hallway. Then he leaned close, whispering, "Grandpa, can I live with you now?" His voice cracked on the last word, and for a second I saw Derek's boyish face, eager and uncertain, reflected in him. My hand trembled as I rested it on his shoulder. "You always have a home with me, Colton." Outside, Evelyn met us on the courthouse steps. She had tears in her eyes, though her smile was steady. "Truth has a way of surviving lies," she said, her hand brushing mine. I nodded, swallowing the tightness in my throat. "It wasn't just truth we saved," I replied quietly. "It was Derek's promise." When we returned to the villa, the halls no longer felt suffocating. They felt like they were mine again, not because the court had said so, but because memory itself had been restored. Colton ran through the living room, his laughter breaking the stale silence that had hung there for too long. Evelyn set a small tray of food on the table, her touch grounding me in the present. "To truth that survives lies," she said again, lifting her glass of iced tea. We sat together, watching the boy explore. Each step he took in that house felt like a step toward Derek's legacy, alive in a way Marla could never erase. I realized then that justice wasn't revenge. It wasn't about seeing Marla broken. It was about restoring balance, about making sure my son's memory wasn't turned into something hollow. That evening, I walked out to the yard. The light was soft, painting the grass gold. Colton was tossing a ball in the air, his laughter carrying on the breeze. I stood at the edge of the porch, cane in hand, feeling the weight of years and battles behind me. "If you ever feel discarded by those you love most," I murmured, "remember, dignity is not theirs to take. It's yours to keep." Marla had left town in disgrace, her name trailing in whispers, but her shadow no longer fell across this home. Instead, the sunlight belonged to Colton, and to me, and to Evelyn, who had walked beside me when others turned away. Derek's legacy was safe, not just in deeds and documents, but in the life of a boy who still believed in family. As the day faded, Colton's voice rang out, "Grandpa, watch this." He caught the ball and grinned, the sun at his back. I smiled, the weight in my chest lighter than it had been in years. Justice may have come late, but it had come. And in its arrival, it healed not just me, it healed generations.